Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Recovery Podcast. My name is Matt, and on today's episode, Natalie and I return to our interview with Rachel Snyder as she continues to share her story and the process of surrender, redemption, and renewal through her higher power and her time in recovery. This was an important episode not just for the podcast, but for me personally. Rachel, Natalie, and I talked through some very difficult subjects on this one. But the thing that stands out to me the most is that Rachel's story and the discussions we share on the podcast are absolutely saturated with the evidence of God's power, faithfulness, and promise. I couldn't think of a more fitting intro and outro for this episode than the song Evidence by Josh Baldwin. So stick around at the end of the episode for a TRP exclusive live cover by Kyle Cogburn, the worship leader here at the Village Church. This is part 2 of Rachel's story. This is the Recovery Podcast. Hey, everybody. Thank you for checking out another episode of the Recovery Podcast. My name is Matt, and I'm joined today for part 2 of our interview with Rachel. If you haven't listened to the first one, that one will be out. It'll already be out by now. Sometimes it's weird for me when I say that stuff because as of the recording of this, I haven't released the first episode yet. So it's like I have to I have to think in the future. Future Matt, what would future Matt say? But I'm joined by my wife Natalie and Rachel, of course. And so before we get started on anything, let me go ahead and get my housekeeping out of the way. And I say this every time that, well, we definitely do encourage everybody on the podcast to share from their experience with whatever recovery fellowship they're a part of. Nobody who shares from their experiences are a spokesperson or representative of said recovery fellowship. It's because, one, every recovery fellowship tends to have a principle of anonymity, and it's hard to do that in this new digital age we live in with podcasts and every YouTube and Facebook. But this is our way, one, of honoring that, and two, respecting the idea behind it, that the reason why nobody wants a spokesperson or representative of a recovery program is that, surprise, most of the people in recovery are addicts, and we're flawed and we can go back out, but that does not mean that the programs don't work. It just means that we're human. So with that out of the way, I want to jump back in this as quickly as we can. But where we left off, first of all, your story was absolutely, it was both heartbreaking and incredible at the same time for me and Natalie and I, because we know we're in recovery with you. I've heard your testimony. I've seen you around the halls over here at the Village CR, and so I know that things change, right? But for somebody who doesn't know you, listening to that first half, the first act of the story that is Rachel, they might not know. They're listening. It's hard. It was hard. There were a lot of things in there that are hard to listen to.
Yes.
And so I don't want to rehash too much of that stuff, because if you haven't listened to it, you absolutely stop listening to this one and go back and listen to the first part. But I felt like that we needed that. What happens after, after the last event that we left off on, and heading into your recovery story, deserved its own episode, part 2. So where we were at, you had just, you were kind of describing your experience at the psych ward and really kind of meeting Jesus in that moment. While Jesus was always a common thread in your life, there was, like many of us in recovery tend to have this story that we understand our higher power is out there, but either he feels distant or we don't feel worthy, or whatever that divide, that gap is. There's some reason that we keep him at harm's distance at best, right? Or just straight up ignore him at worst.
So true.
And all of us who've been on the podcast can attest how great that works.
Right.
But why don't we start there and kind of rehash your experience in the psych ward? Tell us a little bit about where you were at in your life at that point.
Okay.
What happened there, and then let's move on from that point.
Okay. Yeah. So, a little bit briefly about how I got in the psych ward. I had a lot of trauma, and I'll just recap it quickly, but I had lost a daughter. I thought it was the SIDS, and I had found out over time that she had been smothered by someone that was close to me. And then I lost custody of my other two children that I loved dearly. And one was to a divorce and one was to children's services because of my choices and addiction at the time. So I felt God in different ways, through people, through conviction that I tried to avoid like the plague, and I think at sometimes I was literally using drugs and alcohol to numb that conviction to some degree. And I don't know if the word is conviction at that time, but guilt and shame is what it came across like to me at the time. But so I basically just got to the point of I couldn't take it anymore. I got to the end of myself, and I didn't speak about it last time, but I was suicidal at the time that the SWAT team showed up. So it was one of the first times when I had, really like the only time that I'd been suicidal like that, where I just was thinking about my kids, totally in a state of kind of self-pity. But it was absolutely horrifying, the things I went through, but I was really in a place of self-pity. So the SWAT team took me to the psych ward, and in the psych ward, I just had an experience with the Lord where, like you said, Matt, last time, that when you have an experience with God, you know it. There's and you're changed forever. When you see God for who God is and you see his love and mercy, you could hear about it all your life. But when you feel the mercy of Jesus Christ poured out upon you, you are no longer the same person. You become a new creation in Christ when you accept what he's giving you. And I don't know when you feel it, I don't know who could deny that, the truth, the love of him. So in the psych ward, I was explaining how I had a moment of clarity, and I guess and that's what we would call it in recovery, where I heard a still small voice that said, "What if you have pushed everyone out of your life?" And I was going through a mindset of, why is nobody visiting me in this psych ward? Everybody knows what happened to me. I lost my kids. All the hardship I've been through, how come nobody is here to see me? I've been on the news. Like, people know I'm here. And it was like day 2 or 3 and no one had shown up or called or reached out. Not that it's easy to do that when you're in a HIPAA, place, a hospital or a psych ward, but it did give opportunity for that still small voice to come through. And that was just not a thought that I had. I don't know if I had never had a thought like that, but I don't ever remember in that time in my life, in that victim mindset that I had, having a thought that I could be at fault. So it was like, whew, this is different. And then I explained just how I went back, read scripture, and God spoke to me through John 3:17, though first is John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he did not give his only begotten son. Whoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. I explained that I know that verse. I always knew that verse, but the next verse was that God did not send his son into the world to condemn the world, but so that through him the world might be saved. And that was the verse that I hear it from a lot of people in recovery and that follow Jesus, but that when God speaks through scripture, it is illuminated to you with power. It is the truth. It is the living water. It is the living word. And that's what happened. That scripture jumped off of the page, and it was as if it transformed my heart. It was like I heard it for the first time. It was that God did not want to condemn me. That was because I felt so much condemnation for so long, and I had sinned for so long, and I had been hurt for so long, and I had distrusted God for so long. I just didn't even know who this God really was. I didn't know what truth was. So to hear that truth was what I needed to hear. And from there, God just became very real to me, and which I will get into more. But that kind of sets up where I was at in my first step into really coming to know who Jesus was, and my first step of becoming sober.
Yeah, those moments of, like what you'll hear, and if you're not a CR, you don't attend CR, but maybe you're listening and you don't attend any recovery program, or maybe you attend AA or NA where it's not a specifically Christ-centered recovery program. The one common thing you'll hear between all of them is moments, like you'll hear people refer to things like moments of clarity. And for a lot of us in CR, those moments of clarity are, a lot of people will be like, that was God speaking to me in that moment. And it was for me too. My moment of clarity was, and I've shared this in the podcast before, but in the middle of a step study that I was still using, I was basically like just trying, I spent most of the time in that same place of self-pity that you were in,
Yeah.
which is a terrible place to be, because it is a place that is devoid of all hope, because when you're in a place of self-pity, you were not in a place where you were capable to take accountability for anything that you've done, or you're not in a place to be willing to change.
Just so well said. Yes.
And without that willingness to do something different,
Right.
there's just no hope. And
Right.
I had that moment of clarity where God really spoke to me, where it was like, and it was exactly what I needed to hear in that moment to finally get it to click,
Yes.
to fully embrace at least being willing to have willingness, which is where a lot of us start. Faith the size of a mustard seed. And,
Yes.
those moments are so hypercritical for us, because it is so, I'm going to kind of pose this as a question for you of, what stood out for me in my moment of clarity was just how contrasting it was to all the events leading up to that point. It was almost like standing out in the middle of a field during a tornado, and all of a sudden everything stops. That's what that moment of clarity feels like. It's like the chaos stops for that brief moment, and it's like all of a sudden you can see not only your past, and you can not only see the chaos that you've been kind of just resigned to live in, and how crazy it is, right? Like where you're just like, why would I, like that's the thing that like kind of came over me, was like, I don't know why I thought this was okay to continue living in. But also the other part of that, the other half of that is, you're like, maybe there really is a way out of this. Maybe there really is a future out there.
Yes.
For you in that moment, you've got this entire past of harm and pain, and just your life was shattered. You were shattered to your very core.
Yes.
In that moment, describe what that moment felt like for you. Do you relate to kind of what I just shared? Or was it different in some way, or how was that experience for you?
I love your description, because with different moments of clarity, as we move forward in recovery, that is so well said. That is exactly how I would describe it, where things stop and you see hope, you have hope, and you see your past differently, and it's like an awakening. It's like you become alive and awake to a truth that you couldn't see before. And for me, that hearing that still small voice, and really God ministering to me, the same God that I blamed, that I thought I hated, that just the things that I did, the way I used scripture in sinful ways in the past to get out of this, or to make myself look good in this way, and that this same God that I did those things to would love me. Like, you're going to forgive me, and you're going to be here in this psych ward with me, when I am now seeing that, oh my gosh, I've gotten myself here. And God didn't put it all on me at once at that time. He gave it to me in little pieces, which I now learn that God gives us what we can handle as we can handle it, and walks through it with us so that we can handle it. But I did see some of what had got me there. And God basically gave me this montage where I was sitting in the psych ward, just, in thought and in prayer. And I could see that I had hurt other people, and that it was not all other people had hurt me. I had been hurt. Yes. I had been abused all my life. Yes, those things are true. But I had also hurt other people, and I had been abusive in the ways I'd been abusive. So he was showing me both. And at the same time, he was filling my heart with this love, like this mercy. Like, I understand, child, but he's saying, I forgive you, but know that you have hurt others in the same way that they have hurt you, you have hurt others. But I forgive you, and I want you to have forgiveness and mercy for those who have hurt you, the way that I am pouring this like living mercy out on me. So it was the beginning of it was so much at one time, but it's like when you hear from God, you have perfect understanding about these complex things and wisdom from a higher place. So yes, it was definitely as if things stopped and I had hope, because I had mentioned that I was in the middle of an eviction. I had charges against me. I was facing the final court case for losing permanent custody of my child that had been in children's services. I hadn't seen my daughter, my surviving child, for a while, and she was on my heart all the time, every day. And just things were so much falling apart that I had no, really, what can I hope in right now? How can I move forward out of this? But I had this perfect peace that God is gonna get me through this, and He sure did. But it took a process and time, but that's where it started. So I know that's a long answer to what you asked, but yes, it definitely was a moment where things stopped and I could start seeing with some clarity.
Well, I mean, they're critical, and I think everything you just shared, because there are people out there. I really hope every episode I do, and especially episodes that I do, that share people that like yourself, that you're sharing the details of you're kind of laying bare of you at your lowest.
Yeah.
I pray every episode we do like this that there's somebody out there in that same place that hears this because they need to hear that. And I think you would agree with this, that there was nothing that we had done to in kind of the royal we here in terms of everybody in recovery who's had those moments of clarity where God has kind of stopped the chaos long enough for us to see a way out, to have some clarity about our situation, is that they often come at the time that we deserve it the least.
Right.
Almost always. I was at the worst point in my life when I had mine. It sounds like you were at that same place where you were just at the end of yourself.
Yeah.
And it's beautiful in the way that God meets us at those moments. It's almost like we have to get there for a lot of us to be willing to accept that we need a higher power.
Yep. Yes.
And you said something earlier about how God kind of gave you little pieces of, like, kind of small bites for you to digest your role and your acceptance of what you were responsible for. And
yes.
I've heard it thrown around a lot, and I don't think this is what you meant, but I've heard it thrown a lot, like God won't give you more than what you can handle. And I just think that's horseshit. It's not true. I just have never seen where that's true.
Right.
What I've seen is that God will give you what you need at that moment to work through with Him. He will always, in my life, and in my life, He's always exposed me to things, especially since I've been sober. He's exposed me to many things that I cannot handle, my recovery being one of them on my own.
Right.
I cannot get myself sober. What He exposes me to are things that I can't handle, but He can handle for me.
Yes.
Honestly, it's not even just for me, it's with me. He's like,
Yes.
it's my power that's going to carry you through this, but I want you to be a part of this process because it's you in the face of things that you cannot handle, that you rely on me to take care of. Those are the things that grow you as a person. Those are the things that start to strip back those character defects.
That is so good. Yes.
And it starts with those. Our first experience with that is those moments of clarity. That is the point that we start to change from where many of us are at in those moments of, I clearly can't handle this. I'm out of my depth and there's no hope. All of a sudden God shows up and you realize, and it's like God knows that we're finally in a place to accept that I don't want to die.
Right.
I want a future. I just can't do it.
Yes.
That's in those moments, it's funny because for somebody who's not engaged in recovery or maybe hasn't engaged with recovery yet, that sounds completely hopeless. But for those of us in recovery who look back on those moments, we all look back on those moments with fondness because we realize that's the point that that is the moment that my life really started. So for you in that moment, when you have this experience and you're still in the psych ward, what is your perspective looking forward out of that? Where are you at in your life now? Like, what's the next steps for you in your story, and how's your mindset changed? How's your experiences starting to change in kind of the more practical part? Like, where is your life moving forward?
From the psych ward?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I knew that I had I would say there was a surrender that occurred at that moment, which was I've been holding on to all these ways of controlling and bringing comfort to my life or staying in what I thought was comfortable, even though it was horrible, horrible situations, but like it was what I knew. And so it's, I'm going to give that to you, which at that point, it was very easy because sometimes it's a choice to be obedient. Sometimes in our sin nature and in our work, and when we're out in addiction and stuff, it's difficult to make that tangible decision. I'm going to just, sometimes we can't, I'm just going to stop. We need a higher power to help. So but I was at a prime place in the psych ward. So it's like, God, I'll take I'll take your help. I need your help. I don't know what I'm going to do. I have no idea. And God really just helped me see that I don't even need to look far. I don't need to look far ahead. Don't worry about your future. I mean, scripture tells us that, do not fear. And it's when that's all you've done is worried about your future and looked at your past, being in the moment of now is really a new concept. And I think that was my first time of God helping me be in the moment of now, of just living for today and just taking whatever step he was going to show me. So it was, looking back, I look back at some of the things that I did at that time, and I'm like, they weren't perfect, but from what my resources were, from what my mindset was, and from where I had come from, it was beautiful the way God, loves us in our sin and uses what things are around us, what things are in our life, and brings new things so that we can continue on in our path in a right way and continue moving forward. It's not like he flips a switch and we become perfect in that moment, in the here and now. But so I just, I had hope. And I also will say that there was some kind of manipulation that I don't know if it was, I'd call it a spirit of manipulation that had been with me for a long time, where I had manipulated, and to the point that times I didn't even know I was doing it. It was an absolute survival mode thing. And times I did know and knew exactly what I was doing, but I left that psych ward and that was gone. Whatever that was had lifted. And I mean, it was like the truth had come in. So something was broken off of me at that time. And that power, which I know you're familiar with, you see God work something powerfully in you to where you see that you're different. You feel that you're different. You're thinking differently, and it can happen in a moment, one moment of clarity. It could be one thought, and it's like I have been transformed. This is bigger than me, and I just have the chills as I speak about it. But I walked out of there with hope, and one miracle that I'll say that I knew was a miracle while it was happening was that God was giving me peace about being on the news. So I had lived in LA, tried to make my way as an actress, tried to do all this stuff, tried to be a model in my past. I had so much fear of man and so much desire to be accepted by public and worried about what people thought. But in that psych ward, God also gave me this complete peace about, being my reputation being, here I am on the psych ward, a lot of things being said about why I'm being taken to the psych ward on the news. And I just didn't care. It was like, oh my gosh, I am free. That mask that I wore, which I thought I had to hold on to with every bit of my being, that no one would have been able to rip it from my hands. And not just one, there were probably 100 masks I had at that point. But it was like they were just laid at the floor. They were gone. And I was okay with like, this is who I am. I don't have to hide anymore. I can't hide anymore. Here I am. But the peace that gave me was something that no one could have told me. Give me those masks and I'll give you this peace. You could not have told me or ripped them from my hands and I would have traded you because I wouldn't have believed you.
Man, that is so good. I love that. It's a part of my recovery that I haven't really thought about, but absolutely it is something that I experienced where, and I don't mean to jump in on this one, but it's, man, I didn't realize until you mentioned it, just how grateful I am for that aspect of it. Because when I had, I'd kind of crash course my way into addiction, where I hadn't really done anything. And then like in a month I was like straight into full blown addiction and overdosed. And I was so ashamed. And I remember the first time I came into CR, which I had been to before. I'd been in meetings and, I'm sitting there and I'm in a room 2 doors down from us where we're sitting right now, and everybody's sharing, and I just feel this overwhelming, like, you need to share what's going on. And here's the thing, other people had probably known about it already. And the people in recovery, you know how it is, for those of sin, like we see, like when people walk in the door, we can see that people are hurting. Like
Yes.
they don't have to say anything. Like there are people all the time that walk through the door. I'm like that dude's in pain. Like
Yeah.
there's something, I may not know exactly what, but I can tell. It's just because we've been there, right? Like we
Yes.
understand where that place is and what that's like. And when I was so terrified to share, but I finally did, and I talked about my overdose and everything, and I'm weeping while I'm sharing. I'm literally covering my eyes with my hands, and I'm afraid to look up because I'm just expecting that when I open my eyes, everybody's just going to be sitting there, arms crossed, just shaking their head like, wow, man, like I can't, we thought you were better. I looked up and could not have been the more opposite. Like nobody batted an eye. And for those and if you're in recovery and you're listening to this, you might be chuckling because you're like, yeah, because we've all been there. Like there's the thing. And what I found is that whatever sense of control we think we have over what other people think about us,
Yeah.
for the people that need to see that we're perfect, what a lot of us tend to find out is that once it's out in the open that we're not, if they're going to leave, they're not people you need anyways.
No.
They don't care about you.
Amen.
And what I found is that finally embracing who I really was at that moment and embracing my faults and my character defects and who I was.
Yeah.
And that was, I'm an addict. Then it opened the doors to all the relationships, to all the people who actually cared about me, because I was barring their entry into my life by, I couldn't, if I let them get too close, they would see that behind this mask is the person I was ashamed for everybody to see.
Yeah.
And there is a freedom, and I love the way you described it as peace. It is a tranquility that you cannot manufacture.
Yes.
And I think most of it is just, we no longer have to invest all of the effort in keeping these masks up for people. Like just that alone is such a relief. Like, oh my God, I don't have to I don't have to pretend that I'm somebody I'm not anymore. And then the other part of that is all of a sudden the people that we need, the relationships that we craved, really genuinely in the core of our being, the people that the community that we wanted, all of a sudden that starts pouring into our lives for the first time. And so when you were describing that moment of not having to put on these masks, it was just like I just got like goosebumps. I'm like, oh man, I remember that. Like I remember how beautiful that was. And I can attest to it now that is not a pressure and a strain on my life anymore, that I have to pretend that I'm somebody I'm not, because I know that for the people that accept me for who I am, those were the people that I cared about, and those are the people that I want in my life.
Right.
And I'm sure that you can attest to that. Natalie can attest to that as well. Is like, that's such a beautiful place. That's what real community feels like.
That's real. Yes.
Sorry, I keep jumping in on these, but like,
No, you have to.
Oh man, this is for as much as I think talking about the terrible circumstances in our lives and the story, that they're vitally important because it's evidence of what God does in our lives through recovery.
Yes.
But this is the part I get the most excited about. Like it charges me as a person to hear about these changes, because it's like, oh, I remember that.
Yes.
Like I relate to that. And it's,
It's powerful.
exactly. So, I feel like we haven't really progressed the story that much up to this point, but I think it's fine. But so now, at the point that you get out, how long were you in?
Just 3 days.
3 days?
Yeah.
Man, that's a lot to happen in 3 days.
It's a lot to happen. The last day was when a lot of my God experience really happened.
So what's next? What happens next?
So from there, I left. I had hope. I was responding to people differently. And I hear some people's stories of having an experience, either having a God experience and becoming different. But I literally stopped biting my nails that day. I know that's just a side note, such a small thing, but it really was just a testament to the nervousness, the just what God was doing, that I was a new creation in Christ. I mean, it was evident. And so I went forward. I felt like I was supposed to go to Celebrate Recovery. I lived with a guy from CR for a little while. And like I had mentioned the last time, that I felt God was telling me to go to a shelter. And that was still a struggle for me. I didn't have to yet because I had a place to live. So I'm like, I just don't know that I should go to a shelter. What is that like? It's such a negative connotation on it from growing up in poverty, and like not part of my life I didn't grow up in poverty, part of it I did, and because of that I think I had a negative thought about it. So I just moved forward and kind of took things a day at a time with where God was taking me. But I will tell you, I started reading scripture. So I had carried a Bible around for so long and never looked at it. It was there just as like I'm a good person, but really I'm not, but now it was like, I'm supposed to open that Bible and read it, and I could not put it down. I remember I'd read it sometimes from the morning to the night, and I'm like, I'm becoming one of those people. Like, what is happening? But it was truth, and God had me read some books about boundaries at the same time. The book Boundaries by Cloud and Townsend, and then another book about why is it so hard for me to say no, or why do people not like it when I say no, something to that effect. But I just needed to learn. He was trying to tell me learn how to set boundaries, but he was speaking to me about who I was in his word and his love for me. And I was just getting built up in the word of God. And that was a quintessential part of my life. I mean, I know that that was what God wanted for me. And that gave me a foundation to know what truth was. Because like I told you, in that victim mindset, I made up my own truth. So it was like, okay, it's a survival mode tactic that I didn't try to use, but it was like, this is how I'm surviving. Everyone else is at fault for my problems. So now it's like, this is what God says. And that started to get poured into me. So I had a foundation to walk on and live on. And I went to God told me to go to Celebrate Recovery, and when I say God told me, it's like He speaks it to my heart where I'm convicted. I know this is where I'm supposed to go, and so I went to CR, and I went to a place called the Eve Center locally here, and I felt like I was supposed to become a peer counselor there, which I did, and get counseling there also, and then I also began my journey of CR, and that was the biggest thing was CR, coming into Celebrate Recovery. Every program is great, but this is where God was calling me. And I mentioned how the first few times that I walked in here, there was authentic love. And like I know we talked, Matt, that you can't even really, when you don't know what authentic love is, you don't know what it is. I mean, until you know. So it's like you think, what does this person want from me? Or what is this fake, But it took a while of coming back to Celebrate Recovery and seeing the same people really care, really reach out, really say they can't wait to see me again, hug me, love me, listen to me. That was so different for me. And to see that consistently just did something to my heart. And that's when we see the hands and feet of God moving. And God loves to work through his people and his church and his body. And he sure did. So I kept coming to CR because that was really why, because I felt accepted. And like you said, I felt loved enough over time to be able to start sharing some things and get freedom. When I first started coming to Celebrate Recovery, I did have this mindset where I needed to have like a purpose to be here. God gave me grace in that. He knew where I was at. And so I would come and I felt like I had to say something wise. I remember thinking, oh, God, help me say something wise in this meeting when it would be my turn. And a lot of times he would, and I would come back. It got me back the next time. I felt important. But over time, I started to hear other people really share from brokenness. And I started to realize, bless you, no, have at it. I felt like I can share from brokenness too. It was you hear people that you respect. Like I saw people in this recovery community that I really respected, and I really heard their story, and I saw them lead and love. And I'm like, I want what this person has. I want to be more like this person. And maybe I can, because now that I'm hearing, they have some of the same past issues that I had. And I remember one day I just felt like it just rose up in me, and I just started to share about some of my sex addiction past issues with, relationship issues. And it just it rose up and came out, and it was like beautiful freedom that, oh, in recovery, we say you're only as sick as your secrets. And there is something powerfully true about that, that when you get rid of that shame and you're accepted, there's just nothing like it. It sets you free. It brings freedom.
So when you say that people loved you, I'm like, all right, Carol. Like, this is where normally she gets her shout out. Like, all right, Carol. Carol is the embodiment of somebody who's just like loves you right at the door.
Yep.
Like,
Yeah.
So as you begin to, it's funny, again, like kind of jumping in a little bit, relating with my own story is like, I kind of had that same thing where I felt like I needed to say something. And it took me a while to realize that like, it's okay to just listen. Like you don't have to say something. And for me, I kind of figured that out by watching guys like Randy and Bob and like all of these guys who I kind of consider in their own rights, kind of in my mind, in my experience, and the people that I'm surrounded, those are kind of like the pillars of recovery. When I think about the people that I thought about when I wanted to write off recovery, that I couldn't because I'm like guys like Darrell Wilson, Bob, Randy, like just, I could go on naming people, Carol and everybody else. Like I'm like, I know their story. And I know that they couldn't have figured this out on their own. And so a lot of times it's not really what we say that has the impact. It's what we do.
Yeah.
And
that's so true.
And it's not, I'm working with a friend of mine who's kind of getting into recovery, and you're good. It's all good. My phone rang the other day, and I'm the host. I'm like, I should know better. And he's like, well, am I going to have to talk? And I'm like, no, like you can just listen. Like you'll be surprised how many people don't like, you don't have to force it, but the reason why there's no set process for a newcomer coming in to a recovery program is that just come experience it.
Yeah.
And the reason why we say that is there are intangible things about a good, healthy recovery program that has nothing to do with the lesson. It has nothing to do with the steps. It has nothing to do with the principles directly.
Yeah.
It's the evidence of what's going on in people's lives when you walk in the door. That's what stands out to you, because I want the peace that Bob walks around with. Like there's something that they have that I don't know how is possible, because and it's one of those things that's like, it seems so foreign to you until you see it manifested in somebody whose story relates to you.
Yes.
And then when you see that, you're like, maybe I'm not as terminally unique as I think I am. And
good word choice.
That's a Mitchism, by the way. That's what he mentioned to me when I first got started in recovery. He's like, you're not terminally unique. We all have something, and almost every single one of us thought like, I am a very special brand of messed up that God can't fix. And so far that is a 0% reality rate. So as you start to begin to engage in recovery, what were kind of the toughest things for you to start to engage with or start to address in your life, as you began to work the steps and you find a sponsor, you go through all that? What are the things that you began to struggle with? Because I think those are, for a lot of us in a recovery, we get started and we start to experience this hope. And then, inevitably at some point in the process, God's like, okay, you're kind of still on milk. Let's start to wean you off of the milk and into some real food, into the meat of what recovery is and what a relationship with me looks like. And then it entails addressing character defects, which none of us like in the beginning.
Right.
Eventually we learn to embrace it and love it for what it is, but it's never easy. So as you start to engage in your recovery journey, what were those things for you that you were kind of those gut check recovery moments?
Yeah. Gosh, there were a lot. I definitely know anger was, and it's something that I still, have to be diligent about giving over to God. But I did not feel anger for a very long time. and I did not know why. And people would talk about their anger, and I'd be like, I don't really have anger. I don't understand. But I actually was so numb for so long because of the pain and the continuous trauma that I just would like have a trauma, put it behind me. Really, it didn't go behind me. It definitely stayed, but I just tried to plow forward. So I did not grieve. I did not grieve what was done to me. I did not grieve the losses of my children correctly. I didn't grieve the abuses I experienced. And having that, I describe in my testimony, having part of that was, it felt like if I opened these doors, it felt like all this pain was behind these doors. And if I were to just open them, like just a little to take a peek about what was in there, the doors would just like, it'd be like a flood that would come and it would kill me, crush me. I'm like, so I just kept them tight. Like, I'm not going to look what's in there. And, but you eventually, your things are going to find you out. But with the Lord and with recovery, it happens in a beautiful way. And that's where I had to share about it. I had to take, like, I don't know if it was a year or 2 years of just sharing every time I came to recovery about the pain and about what, and sometimes it was, this is what happened to me. This is the abuse I faced. This is what the courts did. This is what, my ex-husband did. And I got it out, and I got to talk about it, and I got, a response of love from the people around me. And that's what I needed. And then God helped me shuffle through it and kind of see what is truth, what is your part, what is their part. And that's the beautiful part of the recovery program also, is taking responsibility for what's my part. That was definitely hard for me in the beginning, is that taking responsibility also. I just wanted to kind of, I'm going to work the program, but it's either everything is in the past, like I'm already through that, I don't need to look at it. It was hard for me to come to a place of humility.
Yeah, it's tough because I think you just described the tension that we go through, and we recognize that we're a new creation, right? Like, we know that we're not the person that we were, but at the same time, it's a weird tension that, like, we're not that person, but we still have to work through that stuff.
Yeah.
And it's, as you go through it, it's hard to describe to somebody who's never gone through it why that tension exists and why those things are important. Because on one hand, we'll say things like what Carol says, that one foot in yesterday and another in tomorrow is pissing on today, and things like that. And like, you'll hear that and you'll be like, okay, so I'm just never supposed to think about the future or the past, but it's not really what. It's tough until you experience it to understand that taking inventory and working through things from our past is different than living in it.
Yeah.
Those are not the same thing.
Yes. Yes.
Because, and I think the lens that you have to look through in that is, living in that past keeps me stuck. It means I can't move forward. Addressing the things from my past enables me to move forward. Those are not the same things.
That is so true.
And so for you, as you start to work the inventory process, there's so many things in your life that you described from your other episode, and that you kind of mentioned in this too, that it was tough for you to come to terms with, yes, I've been abused, but I've also abused. And those things are tough to work through your inventory, because it's like specifically with your child that passed, you weren't in a good place in your life. And so I'm sure there's part of you that felt you were absolutely responsible for what happened in some way. At least I would. I'm not going to put that on you, but there's part of me that would internalize that and be like, in who I am as a person, everything bad that happens, I tend to internalize and be like, this is my fault. I did this.
Yeah.
But in the same time, as you begin to learn things about the circumstances surrounding our passing, it's like, how do you work through that to take accountability for the things that you should take accountability for with where you were at in your life, but also forgive and come to terms with the harm that other people had caused you? And that's just the most extreme example from your story. But all throughout your life, there is this duality to every harm that you've talked about, not in the sense of like, you were like, there's certain things that absolutely you were not responsible for. Right. But there, like, a lot of times, as our lives progress, as we continue to live in dysfunction and chaos, the choices we make oftentimes put us in a place, and I want to be very careful with this because there's certain things that, and this is, I want to be very careful here because this is not like a victim blaming thing. I can see where somebody could extrapolate from that. It's not what I'm saying.
Right,
But there
right.
are times that the decisions we make put us in places we shouldn't be.
That's
That
true.
doesn't mean that the things that happen to us are our fault.
Right.
But it does mean that as we allow our life to fall into chaos, there are things that the chaos brings,
Yes.
whether they're our fault or not, that happen to us.
That is true.
And I want to be absolutely unequivocally say that there are harm that other people cause you is not your fault.
Right.
And there are things like abuse. Like, I don't want anybody to feel like especially with you hear this with sexual trauma and
Right.
and abuse, where like that, if somebody does that to you, that is not your fault. It is not your fault. And you should absolutely not feel like that's your fault. But
Right.
I also would be remiss if I didn't lay out the experiences that Natalie has shared with me and other people have shared with me, and the things I've gone through in my own life. Although I don't have sexual trauma, but I dealt with physical abuse growing up, like,
Yep.
and I've dealt with various things. But it is tough as you start to work through this of separating those things, because in the chaos, they all feel like one jumbled mess.
It's true.
So for you, as you begin your inventory process and you start to work through those things, especially those terrible things that have happened, like the things that I just described in your life, what was that process like for you? And how was that? Like, how tough was that separation, that kind of inventory process?
It's beautiful. And because there's a lot of suffering that we do in our past, but then in the inventory, it's a type of suffering, but it's not the kind of suffering we come from. It's a choice to face hard things. So it's not just like it's just a very different suffering, and it's a very mild suffering that we walk into. So I walk into doing the step study, and I'm making a choice to examine difficult things with the knowledge that I know that I will have freedom, and that I will see that freedom on the other side of it. So the step study, the first 2 step studies that I did, I've done 4, or I'm in my 4th, but the first 2, I did have a lot of like, these are the things that were in my past and less about what I'm struggling with now. It's like, these are the things that I've overcome. In my 3rd step study, I had a aha moment early on where I was like, I don't need to keep going back through the things of my first 2 step studies and like all the things that God has already healed. I need to figure out, where am I at right now? And it was like God brought me to, these are the things that you're struggling with right now. You're struggling with boundaries. You need to forgive. You need to confess this. So that was really where I feel like I took off again in my journey. But God was working the whole time, and it took me time because I had so much to struggle with denial, and also with wanting to be accepted still, that God was working out in me, and fear of man and people pleasing. And I would say also that that boundaries was a big thing. You talk about being in chaos and that tension. That was boundaries for me. And Lisa Turkers wrote a book, Good Boundaries and Goodbyes, and talks about we have to learn to set boundaries, and if we don't have boundaries, we're in chaos, because there's just no end of me and no beginning of someone else. And I'm still working on that. That is a process that God is really unfolding for me at a whole nother level right now. But through the step studies, I had to learn that, like you said, with being in bad situations, that I certainly as a child, we if we're abused, that's not anything that I caused. But when I became an adult, and I was raped on multiple occasions, I did not choose the rape. But I will say, looking back, that I made some choices that put me in situations that I would not make today. Now, I know my mindset was different. I was sick, mentally ill in many ways. And so I made choices to survive at the time. But now I know I can make different choices. And those choices, a lot of them were because I was in the chaos of having no boundaries. So I allowed people in my life that would abuse me, that would harm me. And I would be too afraid to say no, or I felt like if somebody were to speak something over me, I would allow people to speak things over me that I never should have given any business in my life to speak anything over me with authority.
Mhm.
But I was so afraid, and my tendency was from being abused was to cower and to say, okay, well, what can I do to make this better? What did I do wrong? And God has really just strengthened me to learn it's not you. You haven't done anything wrong in this situation. And so to have a voice and to say, this person is not healthy, they don't get to speak over my life. And this person is, not that they're just written off as bad, but they're not healthy for my life. So I don't give them the right to speak over me in that way. And then this person may has this struggle with dysfunction. I see it, and I'm going to have to set these boundaries so that they don't just plow over me. And still, like I said, that's a work in progress. But I've seen God do that work with trying to help me understand boundaries over the years, and it's taken years. And I'm really I'm really working through it now hard.
It's difficult, and I think one of the best kind of skill sets you learn in recovery is through the inventory process. And I think the inventory process is the most literal manifestation of this skill set. Is a big part of the inventory process is you go through the events in your life, you go through the things that have happened,
Yep.
and you have to make the distinction of these are the harms that I've caused, these are the harms that have been caused to me,
Yes.
and out of that, what you do with those things once you have kind of dissected them and those, because a lot of times we tend to think about them in entire situations, right?
Yeah.
Entire circumstances, and usually in a full set of circumstances with people involved. Not always, but there are a lot of times that there is harm done on both sides when there's conflict, right?
Yes.
And so, learning how to take those things and taking what we call owning your side of the street, right?
Yeah.
And out of that, we learn, okay, when it's something that I've done and it is appropriate for me to make an amends, it's always appropriate to make an amend, but in terms of what kind you do, sometimes those amends are literally going to the person saying, I'm sorry for what I've done to you. I take accountability for what I've done. This is what I'm doing to not make that decision again,
Yeah.
to cause that harm. Sometimes those are living amends, and those are, it's not appropriate or it's not healthy for me to have contact with this person. Maybe they've passed, maybe they're just not around. And
Yeah.
my living amends is basically the promise of what I'm doing to not be that person anymore is the best that I can do.
That's so true.
On the flip side, on the other side of that, for the harm that's caused to us, the forgiveness process is kind of its own animal, where we learn that to forgive is as pure and as healthy of a selfish decision as you can make in a lot of times, because what forgiveness is really about is you. It's about getting you in a place where that person, whatever they've done, doesn't hold power over you anymore.
Right.
And you can move on from it. Where that applies in a more daily principle skill set is what you just described as boundaries. And that being that we kind of, and a lot of times with setting boundaries and working through conflict and dealing with somebody who maybe doesn't want to adhere to your boundaries is kind of that same inventory process of understanding what you're responsible for and understanding the things that you can't control.
Right.
I can't make this person do what I want them to do, but what I can do is set boundaries, and how I enable them to interact with me and affect me is up to me. And that is not an easy skill set to learn. Some people do it more naturally than others. For me, once I established a sense of self-worth again, I found that boundaries were a lot easier for me. Like,
Yes,
I'm like,
absolutely.
I'm not, you're not going to treat me this way, because here's the truth that I know that God has spoken into me about who I am as a person. Doesn't mean I'm better than you. It just means that you can't treat me like I'm less than what I am.
Yes.
But there's a lot of freedom that come with that, because for a lot of us, dealing with conflict and dealing with people who maybe who don't display the most healthy of behavior towards us.
Yeah.
A lot of us who come into recovery, it's uncanny that we don't, and a lot of it I think comes from the fact that all of us come in with about as deficient on self-respect as you can, as a human being can, that a lot of us struggle with boundaries and figuring out, okay, I don't like that this person treats me this way, but I don't know what to do about it, because it just
Yes.
feels like it's in your face. And a lot of us, we either become very outspoken and we do things we regret, or we cower and we kind of just shut down and take it like, this must be my fault, or how I got to fix this somehow, or I need
Yes.
to manage this somehow.
Right.
And so that's, there's a reason why we have a codependent group at Celebrate Recovery. And that's,
God bless it too.
yeah, we need, and there's also a reason why most of the addicts in the recovery will also usually come to terms with like, I've got some codependency as well. And it comes from that lack of understanding how to set boundaries. So,
Absolutely.
Sorry, I had you muted. Natalie had to go to the bathroom, so I had to mute her. We all can't be as professional as me, I guess.
So that's the beautiful thing about recovery, is it's not just about addiction like itself, right? Like the root of the problem is universal to everybody that comes through the door, right? Like lack of self-worth, trauma. I mean, the root of it is the same. It's just how we deal with it. But
That's
I
so
know,
true.
yeah. And I know like the amends process on the flip side for somebody who's been sexually abused is very difficult.
Yeah.
It's you have to get out of that victim mentality, and you have to really push through it. And I remember when I was going through my inventory and my amends process, I had, I think it was Carol said, okay, so if that person is sitting across the table from you, like you're at dinner with the Lord, would you be okay with that person sitting at the table with you? And I was like, dang, I don't know. And so starting there and going backward of like, just trying to get to the place of realizing that they are just as broken as I am, and getting to the place where, of acceptance of this happened. And I think that's so hard to get to when you're in recovery, of the acceptance part. And when you're going through amends of like, okay, this really happened.
That's good. That's
Because
so
you
true.
get so numb to it, like, oh yeah, it happened.
Right.
But when you're trying to get through that process of amends and boundaries and everything else, it's like, oh yeah, like it really happened.
And like in the place of I'll forgive you, but it doesn't make it okay.
Right.
And I give it to God. I give it to the Lord. And like, I love what you said about how you see them as broken too. You see that they have their brokenness, and there's why they made their choices. We can't judge, but what we can judge is that was not healthy for us. It did damage to us, and we have to work on those things, but we don't have to let those people in our lives anymore. We can make healthy boundaries to move forward, but we still can forgive them. And that's just, we learn about forgiveness. I love how recovery speaks to forgiveness, about it being a way to give it to God, and that vengeance is His. So we give it up to Him, and we let the person off the hook. And I know they said like that tightrope where you have somebody on the hook, and you let go of your end of the rope. And something happens in the spirit realm when that takes place. It's like God has a room to work now because you don't hold it anymore.
Right.
And I mean, a side note, I found that in many relationships where I've been like, I feel like I have to hold this together. I have to try to convince, or I have to try to, whatever I'm trying to do. But when I control, I let go, give control to God, and then God can take over. And that's, I think, with forgiveness too, is sometimes there's an element for me where working my inventory where I had to say, I was trying to hold this person and trying to get what I needed, what I thought I needed or wanted from my emotional response, from just holding on to the anger or whatever it is, or wanting this outcome. But when I was able to say, you know what, God, I give it to you, and I want freedom, and I'm going to start praying for this person like your word tells me to, and pray with whatever seed of prayer I can start with. God will grow it into something beautiful, and He changes our hearts toward other people, and helps us grow and heal ourselves through it.
Sorry, I'm just kind of processing all of that. You mentioned, both of you now have mentioned that victimhood mentality and how unhealthy it is. And I've heard people talk about it before. I don't know that and this isn't like a statement of I'm better. It's just better than. It's just not how I've tended to. I've definitely been in places of self-pity, but as far as victimhood, I've always fought against that in my life, even though I was victim to physical abuse my entire childhood. And
Yeah.
there was a part of me that was like, no, because that I was like, if I give in to feeling like a victim on this, then they win. I don't want to, and to the point that it was unhealthy on the opposite end of the extreme, where I just denied myself any sort of grieving or any sort of feeling the pain of my past
Yeah.
with those sort of things. But at the same time, like when I hear you guys talk about the victimhood mentality, knowing that you both have experienced sexual abuse, there's something uniquely insidious about sexual abuse that, having not experienced, I can still tell that there's something about it that's different than other kinds of abuse, because it can, at least in my perspective, and feel free, I'm kind of stepping into territory in which I'm ignorant. So, I definitely don't want to say things wrong, so feel free to correct me. But it feels like a part of what makes it so insidious is that not only does it compromise your safety as a human being in the way that I say normal, but your non-sexual physical abuse does, but on top of it, it seems like it just completely strips you of your autonomy.
I think so.
And that is something that is worse. To me, the thought of my autonomy being taken from me is like, I don't know if there's something you can do worse to a person. You can being harmed physically in some ways does the same thing, but not nearly to the depth that sexual abuse does. And so as you're struggling with not engaging in that victimhood mentality, there's part of me that's like, I don't know how you, I know it's possible because I've seen it in your guys' lives and the benefit, but at the same time, as a human being looking at it, I'm like, I don't know how you don't fall into that, because it's because I can't, when it comes to sexual abuse, there is no, like, I just don't think if there's how much more can you victimize somebody? And so what's that process like? How do you guys work through that, or how have you worked through that struggle of not falling into that victimhood mentality? What is that like for just those who might be struggling with it, or people like me who just don't understand it?
Absolutely. So for me, I didn't know I was even molested until years, like I mentioned, just several years ago. So God brought it to me at a time in a place when he was going to help me walk through it. Now, I know other people know their whole lives, and I was told by therapists that they thought I had been abused because my chaotic life was showing elements of abuse, and also losing my voice. I think, for, like you said, sexual abuse stole my voice and my ability to trust my own intuition, our God-given ability to say, this doesn't feel right. You have to suppress that in abuse or rape, and just, that is a really destructive. You're right. And for little, young kids, I was just a little girl, to lose that put me in harm's way so many times. And now I totally forgot what your original question was.
Just as we describe, I mean, all of those things to me on the outside looking in, because it strips you of your voice. I mean, it just, like, to me, there is no worse way to just crush a person.
Oh yeah, your autonomy.
Yeah, it just completely strips somebody of their autonomy than sexual abuse. I think physical abuse is like the gateway to, because that, at the point that you physically dominate somebody, you feel powerless. You feel like you don't have any voice. But sexual abuse is even past that. Like, it feels even, it feels like it hits even more close to home, to the core of your being.
Right.
And so as I hear you guys share those stories, and I don't want to make it sound like I'm like encouraging somebody to engage in that victimhood mentality, but at the same time, I'm like, I don't know how you don't. Like, I don't, in the sense that, in my human sense, I understand that we serve a higher power that is even bigger than those sexual traumas, right?
Yes,
and
it is.
And I genuinely think only through his power can somebody overcome something like that.
Yeah.
But how, when you're, as you begin to work through getting out of that victimhood mentality, there's part of me that just doesn't like, what was that process like? Like, how was that? Was it something that, was it like a moment of clarity thing like you had before, where it made it you were able to step out of it and never go back in? Is it a struggle that you still struggle with not stepping into that? Or is it something that once you work through your inventory process, you can kind of close the chapter on that? Or maybe it's all of those things. I don't know.
For me, it was definitely a process. And there were points when God revealed different things to me along the lines over time. First was just working through that it happened to me. Like, thinking about it, like, I am going to have to deal with this. It is no longer, God is telling me I can no longer press it down. And it's because God loves me. I thought I was saving myself by pressing it down. He wants me to heal from it. So he would let it surface, and just enough to where I first walked through some of those memories, and he's so gentle. He would give me just enough. And when things got like to a place where I didn't need to know, I didn't know. God didn't have me look that hard into it. And, but I processed what happened to me, and I dealt with the fact that this is me. Because I remember talking about it like it was a little girl. Like, this happened to this little girl, this poor little girl. That little girl is me that happened to. So I had to bring the two separate individuals together as one. And I think that is sometimes disassociation happens from abuse, where it's so traumatic that you do kind of, a part of you disassociates. And
I would say I did a lot of that with when thinking about my physical abuse in my childhood. There's like, and part of that was like, maybe my way of making myself feel better about it is like, well, that wouldn't happen today. Like, I literally remember the moment that the physical abuse stopped with my mom was the moment that she went to throw something at me and I caught it. And then she tried to hit me and I caught her hand. And I'm like, and all of a sudden I'm like, oh, I'm bigger than you
Praise
now.
God,
You can't do this anymore. And but while I'm thankful that eventually that abuse stopped, doesn't mean that I worked through. It wasn't like, oh, okay, everything's fine now.
right,
Like, there was a part of me that just locked that away. Is like, that happened. And honestly, it probably drove a lot of this mindset that I'm never going to let anybody hurt me like that again. Where I locked that away, almost like I almost look back on my childhood like, with like some disgust, like I don't want to be that. I don't want to be the little boy that let that happen to him anymore. I'm not going to be that person anymore. I almost looked at it like I would look back on that time in my life like I was too weak to defend myself, and I don't like, that's not a person I want to be. Meanwhile, completely ignoring the fact that there was nothing I could have done. I never understood that, like, oh, you're supposed to trust your parents to not just to protect you, much less not abuse you.
That's
so it took me a long time to get to a place where I'm like, that happened to me. Like, there was nothing I did to deserve it. It just happened.
And processing it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, maybe I don't think physical and sexual abuse are apples to apples entirely, but I can see where there is some overlapping principles going on there.
Yeah. Your personhood is being violated. Your ability to trust others and yourself is being violated.
Absolutely.
Yeah, your sense of safety is completely violated, and you're being traumatized. So I do see a lot of similarities in it. And with the victimhood, I think, and getting back to that process, like the dealing with it, looking at it, and like you said, this happened to me, like. And also being able to give yourself grace, like stop thinking I caused it. Like, even if you logically try to think about it, so I would logically not believe I caused it. I wouldn't be like, oh, I did this, and that's why grandpa did this or great grandpa did this. It would be more like just an inner foreboding, just like I must have caused this, and I must deserve it because it keeps on happening. And not only did it happen then, but it happened from all these other times. So it's like just a belief that I'm inherently deserving of bad things. And then also I think it reflected on who I saw God as, because when you're abused by people that you love or that are supposed to be parental figures, and this was my great grandfather, but there were a lot of people that abused me, husbands and boyfriends and relationships with women, with friends, where these are people that I was supposed to trust, that were supposed to be protectors or were supposed to help keep me safe, and they did not. So
at the very least, have your best interest at heart.
Yes.
On the most basic human level, right?
Yes. And I mean, go ahead, Natalie.
I think victimhood too, for me, was a sense of security. Like it took the shame away because I put myself as the victim. But in reality, switching it over, I was victimized, but I'm not a victim. Does that make sense? Like,
Yeah.
Well, I think living, and again, like I feel like I'm not sort of. I feel like I'm trying to be very careful. I try to be very sensitive when it comes to things, to like, especially with sexual trauma. Just having not experienced it, I've seen the harm that comes from. And I'm only explaining this for people who like Matt. We get it. Like
Yeah.
you can move past it. You don't have to walk on eggshells. But I've seen the harm that it causes. Like I've seen the conversations where people have been like the classic example of like somebody like a woman is raped. What were you wearing? Like, fuck out of here. Like, and sorry for my language, but
Absolutely. Yeah.
like, and I've seen it in person. I've seen the harm it causes, and I'm like,
Yeah.
that doesn't matter. Like,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter. Like,
it
and-
does to the victim.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
Because then you go down that trail of like,
and I've even seen people say stuff like that with good intentions, and their
Yeah.
intention being like, you need to protect yourself.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that it's somebody's fault
Right.
that it happens, right? And so, like, that's the
Yeah.
reason why I'm being
No, there's a tension there. I get it. Yeah.
And so
there
that's
is.
the reason why I want to be as absolutely sensitive to this as I possibly can. One, it's a hypersensitive topic, and two, I don't want in any way to ever come across that I've portrayed that opinion, as Natalie burps in the mic.
I was like, that was not me.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, that was something else. But yeah, I don't want to ever do that, especially in a recovery podcast where we're talking about healing and getting like, oh, by the way, it was totally your fault. That's not what I'm saying at all. I don't ever even want to come close to insinuating that. So that was my disclaimer of that. So that's why I kind of seem like I'm constantly trying to check in. Like, I promise I'm not trying to say anything. But as you dive into things like this that are inherently messy, it's, and the reason why I'm asking these questions as well is that I think it's important that just because you haven't gone through it doesn't mean that you shouldn't try your best to understand. Maybe you can't understand it. There's a certain level of sexual trauma that I will never understand for as long as it doesn't happen to me.
Yeah.
There's a certain experiential element to it that you have to, and like once you can't truly understand it until you've gone through it.
Yeah.
And I would love for nobody to go through it, but its reality is that it happens. And the reality is that if you're listening to this, you probably know somebody who's been sexually abused.
Yeah.
And so even if you don't understand it, or even if you've not experienced it, like, it's important to understand these things because we all love somebody most likely who's been sexually abused. And it's important to know, like, so you don't make a comment like, what were you wearing?
Right.
Like I've heard, like I've said, I've heard somebody make those comments. I genuinely believe out of a place of love of you need to protect yourself, and I can't be there to protect you all the time. And if you make bad decisions and put yourself in bad situations, like, and I know that the probably the motivation was like, take care of yourself. Like, I love you, take care of yourself.
well, and I think too, it's a level of guilt on their part, like especially when it's somebody close, right? Like,
Yeah.
they feel guilty that they weren't there to protect you. And so a lot of times that's where that comment comes from of like, what were you wearing? Like, I'm physically not there to protect yourself or protect you. So you're going to have to protect yourself too. And so there's a lot of guilt and shame that come along with that, especially when it's somebody so close, right? Like, they're trying to wrap their brain around how it happened and to justify that they weren't there to help and to remove that from them. So
I think, and for me personally, like, and I pray I never do this with my girls, is like on a much lesser severe thing. Like, a lot of times, like, I find myself doing this because I experienced it growing up, is like, the girls will like do something dumb and hurt themselves, and I'm like, well, maybe you shouldn't have done that, and like, it's honestly not, and I hear myself say it, like, after I say it, and I'm just like, man, like, that does more harm than good. But like, but honestly, just what Natalie described, it's like, there's some instinct as a father for me that, like, when I'm supposed to protect them. If they get hurt, it's like,
Yeah.
well, I can't keep you from doing dumb things all the time. Like,
Yeah.
but it's like almost this sense of guilt. Like it's everything within me wants to protect them. Right.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that it doesn't cause like harm. And the thought that,
I get that.
the thought that I would cause harm to somebody when they're already harmed
Yeah.
is like devastating to me. Like there's nothing that
understand
would
that
make
too.
me feel lower than there's nothing that would make me feel lower.
Yeah. So, I mean, I can speak to it I feel like from somebody who's been in that position and say that, yes, like after I was assaulted, there's been a time when I went to the police and told the police what happened, and they were, did this happen like this? A lot of questions coming my way. And then we can't prosecute because of this reason. And it was like, it felt like being raped all over again. So it's like, I do see where sometimes, or if somebody were to say, why were you there? Why did you allow that? It might have been like, ew, especially in that moment, it may have felt like just being victimized again. But now, at a different place in my life where I'm examining it and I'm not in the midst of it, I can look at my choices and say, I did put myself in some bad places. I did choose unhealthy people in my life. But I give myself grace because I didn't know better. I was in survival mode, but it doesn't mean that didn't happen. And that's not a choice that I made. So I have to deal with both. So I really like your respect for it. And I get where you're coming from because there is both. It's, sometimes we do, even if I put myself in bad situations, it still never makes an outcome of rape okay. Never.
It doesn't justify it.
No, it doesn't matter. And for anyone, no matter what situations they're putting themselves in. I mean, I talked about being a stripper. That doesn't make me more, that I should be more likely to be raped or more. And that may be a truth in the situation, but it doesn't mean that I deserve it, no matter how many times I put myself in that situation. So there's that reality, but there might be the truth that it may happen more often in that situation or, and so it is a tension. I get that.
Yeah. But it's not like, I think all of us who hopefully get into and I think this happens in recovery, but it's not just recovery isolated. I think all of us who try to become better people, a part of being a better person is knowing how to interact with people in our lives that we care about that are hurting.
Yeah.
And to not cause harm on top of harm.
That's
right?
good.
And
Yeah.
I don't like with my girls, I keep going back to that is like I think about like when they're I don't like to think about it, but like eventually they will be teenagers and I will have to Natalie's shaking her head like, oh.
Never.
But
They will be.
like
No.
They will be.
how do I have the conversation with them and how do I handle it? Like I care about you more than the mistakes you make.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if you find yourself in this situation, I don't want them to feel like they can't come to me because they're worried about like that'll disappoint dad. Like,
Yeah.
and I'm gonna just excuse my language, but fuck my disappointment. Like I don't care.
Yeah.
Genuinely, maybe in the moment and and the emotions that I'm feeling, and guilt or pain or fear or whatever. There's the potential that I would say something that I don't mean to come across a certain way.
Yeah.
But like it would absolutely shatter my heart if I felt like my girls felt like they couldn't come to me in their darkest moment.
Mm-hmm.
And I worry about that. Like I worry, with Natalie and sharing her sexual abuse, because, I'm not saying that her parents are perfect, but I know that her parents loved her and I know that her parents would never want what happened to her to happen. I know that if they were there, they would have stopped it. But
Yeah.
the reality is that at some point our kids are going to leave out in the world on their own to live their own lives. And I can't protect them all the time.
That's right.
But I want to make sure that whatever they're dealing with, they can still come home and find a safe place. I don't want,
Yeah.
and having lived in a home that wasn't safe for most of my childhood until I was out of that situation, I don't want my kids to ever experience that. And,
Right.
and just hearing Natalie's experience and hearing your experience, like I said, there's to me, like it doesn't sound like there's anything you could do to a person to harm them worse than sexual abuse. And I worry about that for my girls.
Mm-hmm.
And, So it's part of the reason why I want to understand it. God forbid something happens. I don't want to cause harm. I don't want to re-victimize my kids. I don't want to re-victimize Natalie or anybody else that I care about that might be going through things like this. And that's why I think it's important to talk about it. And I had no intention in talking about this when we started this podcast, but I think it's important. But to kind of switch gears back towards the victimhood conversation that we started.
Yeah.
What about victimhood is just so what is so harmful about staying in that place that it hinders us so much?
Yeah, great question. And I can definitely speak to that. It's like a tornado. It's like you're going, it's just like, I just see an image of like, you're just going down the drain. You're going down the drain. There's nowhere else to really go when you're in that victim place because it just layers on top of layers. It's if you can't examine yourself to say that you have some part or some responsibility in truth, and you just are continuing to blame other people around you, not only are you going to push everyone that's in your life out of your life, you're going to isolate. And I speak because that's what I did. I also am not going to trust anyone because if I'm blaming everyone for the harm that is happening in my life, there's going to be no one left for me to trust. And that's exactly what happened, including government agencies, the people that are supposed to protect me, the police, the children's services when they got in, they were all my enemies. And the spiral just kept going down until it's like I was completely isolated where I'm in my room by myself. Nobody, like that's how bad it got. Like nobody in my life, no family to talk to me anymore, doing drugs, barely coping, barely keeping my head above the water, and still just making up all these lies about like, and it's almost like this switch would go from like, I'm special, like I've been through so much and I deserve this, like this is what I deserve, but also like I'm terrible, I'm ashamed, I'm horrible, I don't deserve anything good. So this like terrible balance and shift would keep happening where I felt entitled, but I also felt worthless. So it's like the victimhood mentality for me was like I expect all these expectations. I expect this and this and this from society and people, and when they don't give it to me, then I can have these whatever. I really can make up my own rules. I can do this to you. I can push you out of my life. I can blame you, and so I just spiraled into that, and I went pretty quick. That my victimhood, some people can make it years. Mine went down pretty quick, and then I ended up in the psych ward, and it was like the blessing was being able to see that I was. Because the enemy takes a shred of truth, right? He takes something that is true, and then he makes it false, and he paints something as beautiful, like, and then when it's really absolutely dark. So he took a shred of truth about I was a victim, and he just played upon it in my mind, like you were victimized, they hate you, they are out to get you, you deserve more, you are better than this, you've been hurt your whole life, you're entitled to this, and it was like this playing was going on. And
Justifies the behavior.
It justifies my behavior too, and that's what the enemy wants to do, is to keep me going down. He wants to steal, kill, and destroy. And so God yanked me up out of that. And that had to be by that, for me, I see it like I had to look at myself for a moment at least to say, I did some of this here. And that was where kind of the aha moment came. But also with the sexual abuse, that was a process of just recognizing that, I was a little bit further along in my recovery. So recognizing what happened, that I wasn't at fault for it, and then forgiving, but not too quickly. Because for me, I actually was like, you know what, I had this tendency to be like, this person is broken, because I know how broken I was. So I'm like, I can see how broken people can be. So I'm just going to say like, great grandpa was really broken. He must not have known. He must have been abused himself, and I'm just going to forgive him. But that was before I felt the anger, before I dealt with what did this do to me? How did this steal from me? How did the enemy use this to harm me for 30 some odd years of my life? And so I had to work that tension out. So I had to walk through what happened to me, deal with it. And that's in pieces, like the stolen voice part or the identity part. I had no idea who I was. I was just in survival mode. I was whatever I needed to be at the time to survive. So it was like, who did God really create me to be? Who does God say that I am in his word? And also by taking responsibility through inventory of these are some bad things that I did. These are some bad things that have happened to me. But look, I'm a survivor, and I have these great qualities that God has put in me, and I'm strong because of Him. And in my weakness, He is strong, and He uses me. He blesses me. Just all the things that He's been doing in my life, the good things. And that's another thing in recovery is to balance that inventory with what is bad, but what is good, and so working that out and then coming back to the forgiveness. So I had to come back to the forgiveness several times. And then I eventually did EMDR therapy outside of recovery, but through somebody recommended by the church. And that really helped also. So it just kind of helps reprocess those memories and puts them in the right place. And but it really was just God guiding me through the forgiveness process. And kind of in my EMDR experience, I repainted a new picture of my grandfather asking me to forgive him, recognizing that he did wrong, and Jesus coming and forgiving him. And it kind of just helped my heart to see, like, this is where my heart is about this. This is what I want, that God has brought me from a place of being traumatically injured and victimized to a place of seeing that this person is broken at the right time, dealing with what it's done to me the best that I can, and working through that process daily if I need to. And, but also saying, I don't need to hold on to it anymore. I'm moving forward into the identity God has for me, into the beautiful life and joy that He has for me. And staying in this is not benefiting me anymore. And I'm letting my grandpa go. He's free. I'm giving him into Jesus's hands. He was deceased at the time, but I prayed, God, if you will it, I pray that he turned his life over to you before he died. I prayed that he repented to you, that he had a surrender moment where he came to you. And because you mentioned in your a prior podcast about, sin started from, it's like been snowballing since Adam and Eve. It's just, there's a lot of places we can put blame, but also the recognition that the world is broken and we have broken people in this world and we're broken people in this world. So there's so many elements to it. And the only way to describe it is just a beautiful process that God puts us on one piece at a time. And in our time, and it looks different for everyone. I think the elements are a lot of times the same, but that process might be different, and what comes first, what comes after, and how He works it out. But that has been how I got out of the victimhood mindset. And I have to still be diligent. I mean, today of just of the enemy putting a thought in my mind and I'm like, not going back there. No, but I know what it looks like now. I can sense it, and it's taken years to get to a place of health. But I think like with anything, I'm still on my guard.
For sure.
Yeah.
I think forgiveness is like that in general, where it, like you said, where if I have to work on it daily, I will. And there are certain times with forgiveness where you can find yourself wanting to slip back into resentment, and you're like, I'm not. A lot of times forgiveness is literally just the choice of, I'm not going to engage in that resentment. I'm not going to do it because it just harms me. And it's tough to get into a place where you can forgive people who've done really terrible things.
Yeah.
Things that you can't wrap your head around. Like,
Yeah.
Other than in our base human level, where you're like, that person is a lost cause. There's no way you do things like that and you're not just evil to the core. And there are people in the world I genuinely think, for reasons that I don't understand, are evil to a point that I don't understand how grace and forgiveness is possible for them, other than I have to just relinquish my even consideration of understanding to God. Like, your ways are bigger than my ways.
Yeah.
Your grace and your forgiveness are beyond what I can understand. I don't know how this person is redeemable at all. Like, and I'm talking like, you can apply that to the most extreme situations. Like, I don't know, like Hitler. I don't know. I
Yeah.
don't want to be dense, but
Yeah.
like,
Yes.
it's like, I can't think of somebody more evil than him.
Right.
And it's like, I don't understand how how do these things go together? My understanding of grace and forgiveness, how it's bigger than even those sins, right?
Yeah.
But I'm like, there are times where I can't understand. I'm like, you know what, God, I don't get it, but it's yours.
Yes.
I didn't make the forgiveness. I didn't make the grace. I didn't make the way. I didn't bridge that divide between our sin nature and your holiness. And that was you that did that through Jesus Christ. So like,
Yes.
I don't get it. I'm going to give it to you. And you, like, a lot of times there's a lot, I'm just like, just tell me what my part in this is. And as soon as I know that I have accomplished my part in this, I'm giving it up to you. And,
Yes.
another thought I kind of had as you were sharing was, when it comes to being victimized and somebody stealing your voice and stealing your autonomy, there's part of me that thinks that you can't truly take somebody's autonomy. And I want to be careful here. I'm not saying that it can't be harmed. I'm not saying that it can't be buried, but your autonomy isn't gone until you think it's gone.
So as a man thinks, so he is.
In certain ways. I want to be careful here.
Okay.
Of not making, like, this is not a pull yourself up by the bootstraps talk for people who have been victimized. But I think that our autonomy is God-given.
Yeah.
In the sense that God has created us as imperfect as we are because of the sinful world that we live in. It is redeemable because he says it's redeemable.
Yeah.
That means it can't truly be destroyed until the day that we are off this earth, until our lives are finished. And so I've never, to kind of go back to your tornado analogy about being victimized and being in that victimhood. I've seen we've all seen images of tornadoes level miles and miles of houses, but I've never seen a tornado rip a concrete foundation out of the ground.
That's right.
And to me, even though we might not be aware that we have value and worth and a level of autonomy that God has given us, there is nothing anybody on this earth can do to truly take that, take that from us. And a lot of times, and to kind of keep that visual going, is, the wreckage that is caused by being victimized, the inventory, the kind of working through it and inventorying it and processing it is like taking all the wreckage of that former home, uncovering that foundation to build it from the ground up again. And I think that's what I see all the time in recovery, is that the hope, and I think that foundation represents a lot of things. I think it represents our value and as human beings that God has bestowed upon us, the hope for a future, the understanding that because he says we're worth something, and because he says he has plans for us and he has a future for us, we have a future.
Yes.
And I think that foundation, the reason, and to keep the visual, the reason why that storm can't rip that out of the ground is it doesn't have the power to. It just can't.
Yes.
And
right.
the recovery process is uncovering the wreckage of our lives to get to that foundation to where God can build us up again.
And you know what I love is that Scripture calls Jesus the cornerstone.
Exactly.
I mean, he is the foundation. Yes.
And I think from hearing you talk about you both talk about victimhood, is that victimhood is almost like refusing to believe that foundation. It's like we're not being in a place where you can recognize that foundation is still there.
That is a good
point. And so, those moments of clarity it's almost like if seeing that little piece of foundation through the wreckage of, like, there is something still there that's salvageable. There's still something there that can be redeemed.
Yes.
And I think from hearing you guys talk about victimhood is it's a paralytic. I think you mentioned that the enemy comes to steal and kill and destroy. I think what I see, probably the most insidious thing that when we refer to enemy, we're talking about Satan, is I think the most insidious thing he does is he paralyzes us. I think there's nothing that he wants more than a bunch of believers who are afraid to do anything.
That's true. Probably true.
Afraid to move forward. And I've heard that analogy used by, like, some evangelical kind of, and I, like, and I don't want to get political, but like some far right, like that means that we need to stand up and voice our opinions and tiki torches and whatever else. But I don't think that's what it means. I think that's not what I mean. And what I mean is that we don't want to be paralyzed into moving into the future that we just talked about, that God has promised for us. And that includes healing. It includes in getting our voice back. Then that includes finding our worth, true worth, that is exist in the fact that he spoke it into being. And I genuinely believe that if it weren't for him speaking into me that I have worth, I would not have worth.
That is true. Me neither.
But the beautiful part about that is it also means that nobody can take that from me.
Yep.
And I believe that's true for all of us on this earth, is that if God promised you something, there's nobody on this earth that can take that from you.
Yeah.
And it's that promise that we build our recoveries on, that it's based on our higher power, and that we are able to unearth that foundation once again to rebuild.
Yes.
And to build into something that we didn't think was possible before. And I see that evidence written all of your life and the things that you've shared. And
thank you, Matt.
I do want to move towards wrapping this up. First, thank you for sharing.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and it always amazes me the conversations that come out of these. Like the things that I kind of tend not to plan out the podcast a lot for these kind of interview style conversations, because I know that there's going to be a conversation that needs to be had that I didn't anticipate.
Right.
And I think they're important. And I closed it with this a couple times, but because I think it's a good question to ask. So let's end it with this. If you were sitting across this table from you at your lowest, before you had that moment of clarity, and for those of you listening, imagine that she's talking to you at your lowest. What would you say to the Rachel that hadn't had that moment of clarity yet? What are some things that you might say?
I mean, it comes down to only Jesus. And it's really difficult to find words that I would speak to myself at the time, because I don't know what I would have received at the time is the problem. And a lot of people did speak things into my life and intrudes into my life that I just wasn't ready to receive. But
let's rephrase
if
it.
It was,
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I feel like this is maybe a better question.
okay.
When you hear people listen to your story, if you hope they take something away from it, what do you want them to take away from it?
Okay, I like that. Okay, thanks, Matt.
Sorry.
I'm like, no, that's me. I took a turn with that
I
probably didn't have to turn.
As soon as you said that, I was like, yeah, I probably wouldn't have heard what I had to say either. So that's a good point that you made. So let's do that other question then.
Okay. So this is what would I tell someone about my story? Like, how would I?
What do you want them to receive?
What I want them to receive? Okay.
Yeah. What do they hear when they walk away from these two episodes?
Yeah.
What do you hope that they walk away with?
That God is not done with you, that you are loved, and that He has a plan for you beyond your wildest dreams. He says that His plans for us are greater than we could ask for or imagine, and that He has plans and purposes for us that are just for us, and good works that He's created in advance that we should walk in them. And only He can bring that about. And I will tell you that the enemy is real, that there is a liar in the spiritual realm that wants us to believe that we are worthless. There's also the world around us and ourselves that are telling us we're worthless, our pain, our past. But that none of that amounts to what Christ did, that Jesus died for us when we were sinners. It says He died for us while we were yet still sinners. And I have a tattoo that says, I loved you at your darkest, just because that's what I wish I would have known, is that when I was at my worst, and I'm talking about not just the harm done to me, but when I had sinned greatly against other people and against God, that He loves me. He died for me at that time. He said, I see you. I know you. I know why you do what you do. I know your pain. I know why you feel what you feel. And I have not left you. And I yearn for you. I mean, you are a pearl of great price to me, and I paid a great price for you. So turn to me. And I would tell that whomever is listening to start with whatever kind of prayer you have. Charles Spurgeon always says, like, it's good to be willing, like you say, also willing to be willing. We don't have to even be there. We don't have to be at the place where we're ready to say, yes, I'm ready to have this transformation. I'm ready to completely surrender. God can help us get there. We just need to start with the prayer that's in your heart. God, if that prayer is, God, I am mad at you. I don't know how to trust you. Why did these things happen? Pray that. If that prayer is, God, I feel hopeless. I want to know more about you. I don't even know how to get to you. You feel so distant. Don't that. If that prayer is, I want to surrender, Lord, help me surrender. I want to give my life to you. And I don't know how. Pray that prayer. Ask him to help you, and he will meet you. You will see him meet you right where you're at. Even asking him to show up. God, I need you to show up. I need to know you're real. I need to know that you are big enough in this situation, in this circumstance to meet me here. I need to know that you love me. I feel like no one else does. Help me. He will help you. So I just encourage you to start with what's in your heart, and don't let anything stop you from that. If it's right now in this moment that God is saying, pray to me. If you are convicted that you need to pray right now, that is the Holy Spirit coming upon you. Turn to the Lord and pray. Pray to him right now. Hit pause, hit stop, go in the other room, pour out your heart to him. He is your loving Father. And take it from those of us in recovery who have done horrific things, who have experienced horrific things. He loves us as we are, and it's his love that transforms us. He does not say, get yourself together and come to me healed. He says, come to me broken as you are. I came to the world to save sinners. I didn't come to save the healed. I came to heal the ones that want to be saved. So let him heal you, and reach out. Get to a recovery meeting. Get into find one near you. Get on the internet, look a recovery meeting up. I go to Celebrate Recovery. I love it. I know there's great recovery programs out there, AA, NA. Find a recovery meeting and get to a church. As much as you may be feeling like, no, I don't want to go around any judgmental, churchy people. Like if that's how I felt, do it anyway, because God is there and God's people are there, and there are people that will love you as you are. So those are the things that I would say.
I can't think of a better way to end the podcast right there. That was great.
Thank you. Thank you, Jesus.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it any better. So thank you again for doing this. And I hope the one thing that I would share that I hope that people take away from this story, as somebody having heard it multiple times now, but in terms of this podcast is, and I hope you hear this from every person who shares their story, is that the evidence is there. If you heard what Rachel just said and you're like, I don't want to pray. Okay, well, here's what I would say is, have you tried everything else and has it worked? If it hasn't, I don't see what you have to lose, because what we've presented on this podcast and the stories is the evidence of what God can do.
Yes.
The evidence that recovery is possible, that there is a hope and there is a future for people who have gone through things that I think a lot of people would have been like, I don't know I would have survived that. And I think everybody who shared their story would say, if it weren't for God, I would not have survived that, myself included. So the evidence is there.
Yes.
So take that, process it, and I would strongly urge you to take Rachel's advice. Say whatever prayer is on your heart. There is no prayer too small.
That's right. You can take it.
It's the faith the size of a mustard seed, micron level prayers that can oftentimes set into motion your future.
Yes.
And to opening you up to the willingness that you don't even have it within you to ask for. So
yes.
Thank you guys for listening. There is more to come. If you haven't heard the other episodes, I would please go listen to them. There's so many. And it's not for the podcast's sake. It's because there's so much evidence of the goodness of God.
Yeah.
Just absolutely loaded into all of these stories. And so know that, by the way, I think about all of you that are listening and pray for you all the time. And I thank you for listening and all the support. So thanks, and we will see you on the next one. Bye.
And all throughout my history, faithfulness has walked beside me. The winter storm made way for spring. In every season, from where I'm standing, I see the evidence of your goodness all over my life, all over my life. I see your promises in fulfillment all over my life, all over my life. Help me remember when I'm weak. The fear may come, but fear will leave. You lead my heart to victory. You are my strength, and you always will be. I see the evidence of your goodness all over my life, all over my life. I see your promises in fulfillment all over my life, all over my life. I see the cross, the empty grave, the evidence is endless. All my sin rolled away because of you, oh Jesus. I see the cross, the empty grave, the evidence is endless. All my sin rolled away because of you, oh Jesus. Oh, I see the evidence of your goodness all over my life, all over my life. I see your promises in fulfillment all over my life, all over my life. And I see the evidence of your goodness all over my life, all over my life. I see your promises in fulfillment